must remember this. A kiss is still a kiss. A sigh is just a sigh. The fundamental things apply as time goes by. And when two lovers woo, they still say I love you. On that you can rely. No matter what the future brings as time goes by.
Our guest tonight is Alan Rohde. He's given us a wonderful portrait of the director Michael Curtiz. In describing a life almost singularly devoted to making movies, he gives the reader a look at how movies were made during Hollywood's classic era, how new technology and social changes affected filmmaking, and in particular, how films were made at Warner Brothers here in Burbank. Film writer Scott Iman has praised this book as, quote, exhaustively researched, well-written, and frequently witty. The book is enlivened by great anecdotes, example of Curtiz's legendary mangled English and syntax, and the hilariously exasperated memos written to Curtiz by Jack Warner and Hal Wallace. Rohde's book is more than just a memorable portrait of the life of Michael Curtiz. However, and tonight's event, more than just a celebration of his most famous film. This book made me understand what is extraordinary about making movies. Movies are both a business and an art, and making a movie is a complex and collaborative undertaking in which hundreds of people are engaged, a highly charged clash of financial and artistic ambitions, as writers, actors, directors, producers, cinematographers, set designers, studio heads, and so many others seek to reconcile what are often differing visions. Sometimes a movie may be a fantasy, a depiction of life as we want it to be, but the process of making a movie, it seems, is always life as it is, and maybe life as it is very essentially. That a good movie gets made out of all the conflict and competition and complexity seems a minor miracle. And so I hope you will view tonight as not just a celebration of one of those good movies that got made, and of a director who made many of them, but a celebration of movie making in this town. It seems that our cooperative and collaborative instincts triumph perhaps more often than we might suppose, that we are able to reconcile and transcend our competing visions of art and purpose and make together a work of art that is some lasting token of that, the small miracle of a movie. Our guest tonight, Alan Rohde, is a noted film scholar. He's the author of Charles McGraw, film noir Tough Guy. Mr. Rohde is the producer of the Arthur Lyons Film Noir Festival in Palm Springs and director-treasurer of the Film Noir Foundation. He has been the host of numerous classic film festivals. He will be in conversation here tonight with George Feltenstein, who is Senior Vice President of Theatrical Marketing at Warner Brothers Home Entertainment. Mr. Feltenstein is a film historian and the producer of numerous documentaries on the history of film. He is the person responsible for having made so many classic film, those small miracles, available again to the public through the Warner Archive collection. I can't think of a better pairing for tonight's event. Please join me in welcoming Alan Rohde and George Feltenstein to the Burbank Public Library.
How is everybody doing tonight?
Good. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Just a couple things before we get started, and I I'll kind of pass this to George, and he can underhand him, and I'll try and hit him out of the park. A couple things. Thank you, Hubert, for that very stellar introduction. Much appreciated. This is really special to me, not because all of you have come here and we're at the Burbank Library kind of in the shadow of Warner Brothers, for I feel kind of like I've brought Mike Curtiz home tonight, which is which is nice. But to share a stage with George, and I have to say, George is really one of my heroes, because the work that I've done with Eddie Muller and the Film Noir Foundation, which basically rescuing films, and the work George has done over the years with the vast, with a capital V, archive of Warner Brothers, by putting out movies that another generation really would not see, that I grew up watching television before cable and before, you had 10 channels, remember that? And the Bowery Boys and the Falcon and all of these movies. Those movies would not be seen today without the efforts of George. So it's just an honor to share the stage with George, and he's one of my heroes. So George, I'm glad to be here with you.
Well, I'm a little odd by
And
that,
there's a lot of good folks here tonight, but I have a special friend who's sitting here in the front row. She is a filmmaker, an actress, a good friend, and working on a documentary of her father. Her father is Paul Henry, Victor Laszlo. Please welcome Monica Henry, who's here tonight. With that, I'll be quiet for a while. George?
Well, I think that we're celebrating two things tonight. We're celebrating the 75th anniversary of Casablanca. And if you say, well, wait a minute, Casablanca was released in 1942, it's now 2018, how does that work? How did Casablanca win the Oscar for Best Picture of 1943? This is one of those movies where you can celebrate the anniversary in either year. And unfortunately, I have many, many times. And I'm being cynical when I say unfortunately. I'm actually incredibly fortunate to do what I do and to be one of the caretakers of our amazing library at Warner Brothers Entertainment. But the film was released in New York in November of 1942. But it didn't play Los Angeles until January of 1943, which is when it had its general release. So therefore it wasn't eligible for the Oscar until 1943 and got the award in April of 1944, I believe.
That is correct.
So we have at Warner Brothers sometimes celebrated the anniversary on the 2000, let's see, in 2003 we celebrated it as the 60th anniversary. And we celebrated the 70th anniversary in 2012. But either way, it's legitimate. More importantly, this is a film that transcends time and can always capture an audience, no matter what their age, no matter what their background. Put them in front of Casablanca, and I guarantee within 2 minutes of the titles, they'll be transfixed. And its power as a motion picture is representative of, and I say this with great pride, the magic of Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers, to me, growing up in New York, you'd see from the legendary Warner Brothers studios in Burbank. I wanted to see Burbank for a long time. And it has been my great honor to work here for over 20 years at Warner Brothers and to take care of the many films in our library. And I don't think there's any one film that defines our classic period more than Casablanca. And more importantly, I don't think there's any director, nobody close, who is so identified with the golden age of cinema at Warner Brothers as Michael Curtiz. So when I heard Alan was writing his book, I was thrilled beyond description, because I've always felt that this is the most underrated director in Hollywood, because we should be talking about him when we talk about George Cukor and Howard Hawks and William Wellman and, of course, Hitchcock and Ford and Wells. And Michael Curtiz belongs in that stratosphere. But there was never a Men Who Made the Movies about Michael Curtiz. There was never an AFI tribute, I think partially because he passed away before the golden age of cinema really had a recognition and rebirth in the early 70s. But I have been reading movie books since I was 4 or 5, and I'm not exaggerating, I was a little bit precocious as a kid. And I have read many biographies of film directors, and I am in complete agreement with the great Scott Eyman, another wonderful author, in his praise for Alan's book. It is a towering achievement, and I thought I knew pretty much Michael Curtiz's story. Well, I only knew Michael Curtiz's story as it began at Warner Brothers, and I learned a lot about his Warner Brothers years that I had never known from reading Alan's amazing book. And it is 700 plus pages, right?
Yeah, well, that includes the filmography and the index, but no, 600. And I think George, your point about Curtiz's lack of recognition in that galaxy of great directors of Ford and Wyler and so forth. And I think a lot of that has to do with timing. Like you said, he died in, I believe, February of 1962. And this was before Peter Bogdanovich and Richard Schickel and this, basically the renaissance, if you will, of golden age directors and that appreciation. The other thing is that Curtiz for a long time was relegated to the term workhorse was applied to him unilaterally by many people over the years. And without taking any pot shots, the auteur theory as promulgated by Cassius de Cinema, and of course Andrew Sarris's American Cinema, Directors of Direction, and I think every cinephile has a well-worn copy of that. I know I do. And it's a terrific book. But Curtiz did not fit into that niche of, hey, where is his signature? Where is the repeatable signature of this guy that a John Ford or a Hitchcock and so forth? So I think those are the two things that really have kind of obscured him over the years. But conversely, speaking about Warner Brothers, when he came here in 1926, he was at the right studio at the right time, and he was, I think, temperamentally suited to working for the Warners. This was to paraphrase a line from a Edward G. Robinson movie, this was a tough racket. and the 20s and the 30s in Hollywood, only the strong survived to claw themselves to the top of the heap, and it was really the era of Warner Brothers. I mean, when Curtiz got there, sound had not come in yet. The first Rin Tin Tin movie had been made 3 years prior to that. They had gotten John Barrymore under contract, which was a big deal. And somehow Curtiz and his temperament, his work methods, and we can talk more about that, I don't think would have fit in at MGM. Just don't think it would have worked. So I think, that the timing thing is really a double-edged sword when we talk about Michael Curtiz.
Well, one of the things that impresses me about his work, and we're going to get into this because we really need to talk about this book, because you all need to read this book, and you'll find yourself turning pages back and wanting to read certain sections again, because Alan's distinctive writing style is very infectious and very witty. And you're covering a career of a man.
Let me interject. Someone pointed out to me, Alan, you really made this sound funny, which is a good thing because Mike really wasn't a funny guy. So if I injected some humor into that, I think it was kind of necessary.
I mean, it is what makes it such a great read, and we're really here to talk about this book. Now, just as a sidestep, Curtiz was at Warner Brothers under contract really from 1926 to 53?
Yeah, he finally got out of his contract in 54. And that was a story in and of itself.
Which is very well told in his book.
Yeah, Jack Warner, God bless him, he ran a great studio, made great movies, but I don't think I would have liked to have worked for him. He was a tough guy to work for. And finally, Curtiz had signed a contract after his production company went defunct. He had his own production company for about 4 films in 47 through 49. And his production company, he couldn't have picked a worse time to start a production company. World War II box office slump, television, the antitrust suit which forced Warner Brothers and the other big 5 studios to divest themselves of their theater chains, the blacklist. So he had the cards stacked against him. Plus, he was not a businessman. He was an artistic man and a film director, but he was not a businessman. So he got a profit-sharing deal out of Warner Brothers, and then come to find out when he said, "Well, where are the profits?" Then that is a whole nother story. But yeah, he was there for over a quarter century.
And over that quarter century, I didn't do a count, but I think I'm looking at least 80 features?
Yes, at least 80 features. I counted, trying to count the films of Michael Curtiz was a daunting challenge. By the time he arrived in Hollywood in June of 1926, he had already directed 70 films in Europe, okay? He had already been a classically trained actor. He was born in Budapest in Christmas evening in 1886. And just pinning down his birth date of it's 1888, it's 1887, it's Christmas Eve, and one anecdote from John Meredith Lucas, who was the director and producer, who was Michael Curtiz's stepson, because Mike married Bess Meredith in 1929, and she was a great silent film scenarist who wrote The Silent Ben-Hur, The Sea Beast, many, many great films. And their marriage endured, for better or for worse, for 30 years, and they were really a partnership, and that's one of the things that I go into. But where are we going with this? I just lost my train of thought.
My point was the width and breadth of the kind of film.
How many films?
But
He did so many films. He did
every genre.
Every genre. He did whatever he was told to do, which in the 20s and 30s, basically Daryl Zanuck, who was head of production until I think April of 33, and Hal Wallace, and then Jack Warner above them, you're going to do this. And Curtiz really didn't have a lot of leeway on choosing what he would direct, I think, until after Captain Blood, when all of his films started to become hits. And then he also got his citizenship. He was not a citizen, and his initial entry into the country was kind of, no one got him a work visa, so they were constantly having to renew this. And he actually, at one point, had to leave the country and then come back in to officially start the clock on his citizenship. It was almost like he hadn't been here. And I have no doubt but Jack Warner kind of used that to keep the leash taut on him and to get him to do. So when he got his citizenship and he was making all these hits, he had some degree of say, which increased as the years went on. But he was basically a contract director and was told to go direct this, and he did this. So there was a period from 1929 to 1934 where he directed like 30 films. He was doing like 6 films a year. And he would do one and then go to the other and then go to the other. And I think Lyle Talbot, who was in several of his early films, says, I don't think Mike liked his wife very much because he never wanted to go home.
But when I look at his filmography, I'm just struck by the constant list of great films. We could play
Yes.
ping pong with the
Exactly.
names of the films. You know, I could toss you This Is the Army, and you could toss me back Charge of the Light Brigade, and Kid Galahad, and Dodge City, and then we were talking about Casablanca, which was preceded by a little movie called Yankee Doodle Dandy. This man was incredible. He could do westerns like Dodge City. I mean, it's really amazing and remarkable. And Casablanca kind of is the summit, the zenith, I think, of his Warner period, because there were great films that followed it, but it really was the apex. Now, you know, Mildred Pierce came after that.
Life with Father.
Life with Father, and even films that were not huge in the history of cinema, but that I think are really terrific, like Romance on the High Seas and The Unsuspected. I mean, just everything he did was amazing.
And the other thing is his ability to discover and nurture talent. He made a movie in 1922 in Austria called Sodom and Gomorrah, which used literally tens of thousands of extras. He and the producer, it was like running an employment agency for the state of Austria. This film just went on and on and on. And there was a tenor with the Viennese Opera who either brought his son by and asked Curtiz, do something with him. I don't know what to do. The son's story was that he was in a bar someplace, and he looked over, and there was Lucy Derain, who was a very famous European movie actress that Curtiz had married and turned into a star. And he said, suddenly this man sat in front of me and said with the thickest possible Hungarian accent, I have imagined you. And this guy said, I'm in front of someone insane. He said, no, you are a beautiful young man. My name is Michael Curtiz. I am making Sodom and Gomorrah, and I have imagined you in the star of your picture. And so that's how the career of Walter Slezak got started. Okay, so you have Lucy Derain, Walter Slezak, Doris Day, Errol Flynn, Ann Blythe, John Garfield. I mean, his ability to spot talent, even when his career started going downhill in the 50s and he left Warner Brothers and he made some somewhat forgettable movies. I mean, he spotted people like Jack Lord and Leslie Nielsen, of all people. I mean, he really understood actors, acting, and working that. He just wasn't a guy that was brilliant with the camera.
And I think of the horror films like Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum. I think of the musicals, which we've already talked about. I defy anyone, even in these difficult times, to watch Yankee Doodle Dandy and not get choked up during the You're a Grand Old Flag number.
Oh, and you know what? Curtiz conceived that entire number with the people marching and Cagney stiff-legging it and then all the flags. And there's a memo in the production files telling Hal Wallis, I think I've got this figured out. This is my idea for this. I'd like you to come down and see a run-through of this. And Wallis came down with Harry Warner, with Jack Warner. And of course, as far as I'm concerned, it's the best number in Yankee Doodle Dandy, and it brings the house down, and it still brings the house down. It's phenomenal. And the other thing is Curtiz grew up and learned in an era where the director was king, and the jodhpurs and the whole stereotype, the riding crop and the jodhpurs, and that actors were marionettes for the director to move their arms around, and you see this in the Fritz Langs and the Otto Premingers. But what Curtiz did was amazing because he adapted himself to changing Hollywood, particularly working with stars like James Cagney, who really directed himself, Humphrey Bogart, Betty Davis, and he was able to work with all of these high-powered stars that over time had a lot of power and had a lot of authority, and yet he was able to adapt his method to working with all these people. So he was not the inflexible autocrat that many people believed. He was still an autocrat, but he knew what mattered to him was making the movie. And when he got done with the movie, he barely had a backward glance because he was already working on the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And what really fired his sense of anxiety was after World War II, and the whole industry became compressed, and television and the other things I talked about, his movies had to be successful because that way he could make another one, and another one after that. So he got very, very anxious. Jack Warner would write him a letter before every movie, basically saying, I know that you're going to come through and you're going to get this done and schedule and everything. And the tone of these letters was kind of like, we're all in this together, but this was more this. It was this. And I think Jack Warner's guidance to Curtiz over a quarter century could best be summed up by two words, and those words are, hurry up.
So the inevitable question, what brought you to take on this daunting task of chronicling the life down to the date of his circumcision? Of all the biographies I've read, I've never seen that statistic.
Well, I have to say, I'll address that little tidbit first, and then I'll answer.
I mean, that tells you how well researched and detailed.
One of the things I did, particularly in his early life, is I actually went to Budapest, and I formed a friendship with a film scholar and film critic over there named Laszlo Kristin. And Laszlo's work was invaluable to me because even after I left, he gave me the Curtiz before Curtiz tour of Budapest and where the first studio was and the Cafe New York and all of this stuff, and it was great. But what Laszlo did, he had old movie magazines from 1913, 1915. He translated articles that Curtiz had wrote over 100 years ago on the auteur theory with his younger friend who lived down the street from him, who became Alexander Korda. Okay? So all of this stuff became available. I went to the Hungarian Film Archive, and they laid out everything, so I was pounding on a laptop as Laszlo was translating it to me. So I got all that. Now, relating to that, his birth certificate is on file in the Grand Synagogue in Budapest. So it was simply a matter of talking with them and getting a copy, and that information on his circumcision was also recorded. So I couldn't help adding that in just as a little, I really did my homework. But at any rate, why did I do the book? Well, I was asked. I had my good friend and colleague, Pat McGilligan, who we had a relationship and talking, and he said, what are you going to work on? He had read my book on Charles McGraw, which was, a much thinner book. And I said, I don't know, you should work on a director. And I started looking at directors and so on and so forth. And I realized that no one had written anything in this country substantial on Curtiz. And I thought about that. And then at the same time, one of my good friends for many, many years is an actor named Richard Erdman, who some of you may know. He was the barracks chief in Stalag 17. He's been on 1 million television shows. We're very, very good friends going back years. And Dick came out of Hollywood High School in 1944 and did a cold audition for Curtiz, who hired him on the spot and signed him to a 7-year contract. And I have the story in the book. It's a great story. It's something right out of, Jesus, this is Hollywood. And it's a wonderful story, and Dick is a great raconteur. But at the same time, Dick was saying, you got to write about Mike. Mike was it. He was the king of directors. So I pitched it and got a contract. And I was off in I wouldn't say I was often running, I was often hobbling, because I got to a certain point and it reminded me of that line that John Huston uses on Jack Nicholson in Chinatown, if any of you remember that movie. You may think you know what you're dealing with, but believe me, you don't. Because as I got deeper into this and realized that much of this guy's life was movies, and how to tell this story, I could not tell this story in like 300 pages. I couldn't do it. And the other thing is his personal life was, shall I say, very colorful. I discovered that there are grandchildren all over the place. He had, I believe, 5 children, all by different women, one by his wife, Lucy Durain, and the other 4 by different women, and his youngest daughter is younger than me. So Mike, he got around, movies, sex, polo. Sex and polo were way below that. He got around. So he had this rather, I guess dissollute's a strong word, but he didn't let anything interfere with his priority of directing movies, no matter what happened. That was the watchword of his life. So he was a very interesting character to write about. I mean, this was not somebody who was, Father Knows Best material or something like that. He was a very, very interesting guy. And he was famous in his own time. He had been forgotten, but during his own time, he cultivated, his wife's best friend was Luella Parsons. So Curtiz took his difficulty with language, which was true, but he turned that into like a public relations attribute. He had his prop man put a sign up on his set, only Curtiz spoken here. And all of this stuff that was in the columns and everything, so he turned that to his advantage as a PR stunt. He would also pretend not to understand English so well when that, in a given moment, when that suited his purposes. But I tried to drill deep down into some of the really famous anecdotes about this guy, because there are many. And
David Niven used one as the title of a book.
Yeah, David Niven used Bring on the Empty Horses and so on and so forth. And one of the things in Niven's book that people have accepted at face value for years is the horses during the Charge of the Light Brigade, that Curtiz was responsible for crippling hundreds of horses or dozens of horses, depending on Niven and whose account. And then Errol Flynn reported them to the Humane Society, so they went down to Mexico, where the laws against abusing animals. Well, I found out none of the Light Brigade was ever filmed in Mexico. There were not hundreds of horses crippled and all of that. And there was an interesting story behind what really happened with that, which was a Humane Society guy came on site where they were filming part of the charge up north, tried to hit up some of the Warner Brothers people for a loan, and then went to the newspapers, and several horses did die. But Curtiz wasn't even there when that happened. So there's an interesting backstory to this. And then, of course, the famous Noah's Ark story.
Yes, and Noah's Ark, I would say, is probably his first tentpole movie, like the first landmark you could stick.
That's what he came to America. He was on a movie set in 1925 in Paris, making a movie with Lily DeMita, another discovery. Contrary to IMDb, he was not married to Lily DeMita. They did have a relationship, I think, during their 3 movies and so forth, but that ended, and there's no record of them anywhere getting married. But he was on the set one day, and there were these visitors talking, and he told his assistant, go tell these guys to shut up and get out of here. And the assistant came back, the AD, and said, hey, one of these guys is named Harry Warner, and he says he wants to give you a job in America. So from that, he ended up coming, and he came to America with a scenario for Noah's Ark. because he had made Moon of Israel with a spectacular rendition of the Exodus, that when it came to this country, Zucker at Famous Players Lasky, soon to become Paramount, bought up the U.S. rights and then buried it in a vault so it wouldn't compete with DeMille's Ten Commandments that had been released the previous year. And he had made Sodom and Gomorrah and a number of these big spectacles. So he was going to come to Hollywood and make this big, spectacular movie on the story of Noah's Ark. So he gets over here, takes the ocean liner over, gets on the train, goes down to Central Station. This was before Union Station was built in '39. No one's there to meet him. He figures out how to get on a streetcar. He goes to the Warner studio on Sunset at that time, is ushered into Jack Warner, who is getting a massage, getting the kinks out. And he says, I have my script here for Noah's Ark. When do I start? And Warner said, leave that on the table. You're not going to make that. You're going to make something called The Third Degree, a crime movie. And that was that. So he had to pivot and learn about American criminal justice, American jurisprudence, and this was based on a 1908 play written by a fellow named Klein. When Warner Brothers bought Vitagraph in the 20s, along with Vitagraph came all these properties that they own, these plays. So a lot of these 1920 movies that Curtiz made initially at Warner Brothers were based on these turn-of-the-century plays that were corny even then, to a certain extent, but the Warners wanted to exploit this already owned material. So Curtiz said in an interview in '47, he said, I didn't know what to do, but I knew my whole career depended on bringing this off. He tried to argue with Warner, saying the script isn't very, he had the script translated into Hungarian, and he said the script isn't very good, it isn't this, it isn't that, and Warner just said, you got to make it. So this was about someone being trapped and being grilled by the police, given the third degree, and being falsely accused, and so forth. So Curtiz talked with the undersheriff of L.A. and spent a couple weeks at the L.A. County Jail watching fingerprinting, watching the prisoners, watching all of this. He said, by the time I got done, I knew more than any of these technical advisors they pay big dough to. I was smart. The other thing he did is that in the script, one of the protagonists is married to a circus performer. So this gave Curtiz the idea of, why don't I just put all these circus numbers in it? So he had elephants, he had close-up people diving into a thing, all this trapeze artists, Hal Moore, the cameraman. They had to make someone dizzy. Curtiz had him shoot through a drop of glycerin, all of this stuff. And Hal Wallace at the end of this said, why did you do that? And he said, I thought something more was needed.
So it really wasn't until 2 years later that he did get to make Noah's Ark.
Yeah, and he made Noah's Ark, and the story that I have read, that George has read and heard about for years, is when he made Noah's Ark, there are some miniatures of the Great Flood at the end of the movie, but there are also stunning shots of standing sets, animals, cattle, extras wearing ancient garb with swords, with tons of water pouring down on them, knocking them down. And it's obviously not simulated, they're not miniatures. So the story is that Dolores Costello, who was Warner's great star during the 20s, was interviewed by Kevin Brownlow for his groundbreaking series, Hollywood. And she was old at this time, very old at this time, and they asked her, I think David Gill interviewed her, and she said, what about Noah's Ark? And she had this very disdainful look on her face, and she said, they called it mud, flood, and blood at the studio, and there was much blood. And according to Miss Costello and several other people, Hal Moore was the cameraman. Hal Moore, when he found out what they were going to do, which is to have these standing sets, have all of these extras, and then dump thousands of gallons of water on top of them, he basically told them, shove the picture, and he walked off. He wouldn't do it. So they went ahead, and this was both Zanuck and Curtiz that did this, and the story goes that 3 of these extras were drowned when this happened. However, This is another Hollywood story that is fossilized into that bedrock that's been repeated so many times. There is no proof that I could find that anybody died. There is no doubt, though, that a lot of people got hurt doing this. And subsequently, when you go back and you look at the records and the files and the newspaper reports and anything that would have reported something of this nature, there is nothing to be found. And that takes you back to Bud Schulberg when he grew up, and his father was running, I believe, Paramount, he said, you know, Hollywood in those days was like Luxembourg. You could murder someone and never read about it in the paper. So I go into that in some sort of context. But that was another one of these stories surrounding the kind of oeuvre of Curtiz, of this director who, if he was shooting a cowboy movie and the cowboy got shot and had to fall in the cactus, well, if the baby had to cry, well, then someone needed to make the baby cry. And a lot of that did go on, but I found out that there was a large gap between a lot of these stories and what actually did happen.
So, if we're going to look at his career, and I know we're running a little late because we want to get some questions in, I would have to ask you, if you had to pick one film of his that is your favorite, which would that be?
Oh, that's like asking me which one of your grandkids do you like the best. I think there would be a tie with that, a three-way tie: Casablanca, Robin Hood, and a movie that is now getting greater attention that he made in 1950 with John Garfield called The Breaking Point, which is a just utterly superb movie that unfortunately got buried because when the film was done, there's a memo from Jack Warner telling Curtiz and Jerry Wald, who was the producer, this may be a film on an order of magnitude of Casablanca, words to that effect. And what happened is during post-production, Red Channels came out with John Garfield's name on it. Warner had already been put in front of the House of Un-American Activities Committee in 1947, and I don't think I'm talking out of school or being offending anyone or Jack Warner to say that he made an ass out of himself in front of the committee by some of the things he said, like anyone that disagrees with this policy, my brother and I will start a fund to deport all of them to Russia, and this type of stuff. So the moguls, Jack Warner, were running scared, and what happened is they buried The Breaking Point. They released it, the publicity was killed, and they never re-released it. But if you get a chance to see it, it's out on Blu-ray now, Criterion. It's a really great film. So I would say those three.
I think they're great choices, and we should note that Robin Hood started with a different director, and there are two directors credited on that movie.
And rightfully so.
William Keighley and Michael Curtiz.
Yeah.
And they needed the film to have a little bit more robust action. So what happened?
Well, the reason William Keighley was the director that started out Robin Hood, they first took the company up north to Chico to shoot a lot of the Sherwood Forest scenes that you see in the film. And they had Carl Jules Wheel, I believe is his name, or Weil. He brought stumps that were painted green and put them in the park in Chico, and it was great. But the reason that Keighley directed it is because Errol Flynn hated Curtiz and went to Jack Warner and Hal Wallace and said, please, please, please do not have Curtiz direct this film. He liked Keighley. He had made The Prince and the Pauper with Keighley. They got on very well. And when Wallace and Henry Blanke, who was the associate producer, or supervisor as they called him, started looking at the rushes, they were concerned that the action wasn't being shot right. There were some specific examples. So when they got back to shoot the balance of the film on the lot and also at Busch Gardens with the archery tournament and all of that, they replaced Keeley with Curtiz. Now, this type of thing happens all the time, but when this happened in 1938, it created a big upheaval because that usually wasn't done. And of course, they gave both of them credit, as George has put it out, because Keeley was a very, very accomplished and successful film director, and they did not want him to leave or to have him be disgruntled, so they had to kind of finesse that a little bit, and both of them get credit as the director on Robin Hood.
But I think that one of the things that I find so amazing about Robin Hood is that Curtiz specifically has the sword fight between Basil Rathbone and Errol Flynn, where half of the action you don't even see.
The shadows.
It's all in shadow. This is filmmaking
At
that
its best.
you would see years later, and even Spielberg has noted in the documentary that's on our Casablanca release now on DVD, Blu-ray, and digital.
Nice, George. Nice. Very nice.
We actually did a documentary which was my idea before Alan wrote his book, but Alan's interviewed in the documentary Michael Curtiz, the greatest director you've never heard of, because until this book, no one had immortalized his life story in print.
I think that was the 70th anniversary that I did that. And my mother, God bless her, who grew up out here, was so thrilled by that because I showed it to her, and I was in the documentary, and also Steven Spielberg and William Friedkin. She said, "Did you get them? Did you talk to Steven Spielberg? You were at the..." And I said, "Mom, we weren't there at the same time."
But the point is that Spielberg learned how to make movies from looking at the great directors that preceded him, and he goes on at length.
Yes, he does.
When we approached him, do you want to be in this documentary for our home video release? Usually someone of his stature will not participate. He was eager to participate because he had such respect for Michael Curtiz. And I know that you and I both share a common friend who was directed by Michael Curtiz when he was a young man.
Rudy.
Well, I was speaking specifically about David Ladd.
Oh, David. Yeah, David's my good
David
friend.
Ladd and I worked together at MGM. He was a production executive there when I ran MGM Home Video. And David is the son of Alan Ladd. And Alan Ladd, David Ladd, and Olivia de Havilland starred in a production called The Proud Rebel,
which I am showing at UCLA on the 9th of March, and David will be there with me in conversation at the Billy Wilder Theater.
Which is why I wanted to mention that. And there has been a stupendous series of Curtiz films running at UCLA that is going to be winding up soon.
No, it goes on till like the 17th of March. The next Saturday, February 3rd, I'll be running 20,000 Years in Sing Sing, the only film with Spencer Tracy and Bette Davis that Curtiz directed, and The Mad Genius with John Barrymore with this. He plays like Sol Yurok on steroids. It's just really, really only over the top as John Barrymore can be over the top. But yes, that series runs until March, and the UCLA Film and Television Archive was nice enough to let me program the thing, and they said, you pick the films, you write the program, and much thanks to Warner Brothers for providing the lion's share of the film. And last Saturday we ran Dr. X, Mystery of the Wax Museum, and the Kennel Murder Case, and I think there was one empty seat in the house. So it was fantastic.
And also in this series, and I believe you're also showing it elsewhere, we recently, in October, restored close to, I think, 16 minutes back to Michael Curtiz film from 1941, The Seawolf, starring Edward G. Robinson and John Garfield and Ida Lupino. And the film was cut for reissue in 1947, along with The Sea Hawk, which just happened to be directed by Curtiz as well. And whereas The Sea Hawk was restored to its original length in the 80s, the Seawolf footage had been missing for 70 years. And we finally reinstated it for our Blu-ray and DVD release. And Alan is going to host the first theatrical exhibition of that.
Actually, I did on December. I did already. December 7th, when the book rollout came, I hosted it at the Egyptian Theater. I'm going to be showing it at the end of this UCLA thing, I think on March 17th. TCM is going to be showing it. They're the TCM Festival. And supposedly I'm supposed to be hosting it at New York in the Film Forum. So it is going to be making the rounds this year. And if you haven't seen the Blu-ray, it is a wise investment. It's like seeing the movie for the first time. It's just amazing. And Edward G. Robinson is just out of his mind. It's a terrific, literally. But it's a terrific movie, and it is so unlike the swashbucklers that he was directing during that time. And I always thought it was interesting. There was two movies with Warner Brothers. There was the actual movie, and then there was the movie that Jack Warner promoted. Because if you read the promotional material on the Seawolf, it's, oh, this is another swashbuckling.
The trailer.
Yeah, the trailer.
The trailer is like, it's another Seahawk.
Yeah, it's
oh,
another
no, it's
Seahawk.
not.
Yeah, and it is a study in doom-laden dread. I mean, you have Korngold does the score, and the beginning, the credits come out, and you think you're seeing the remix of The Bride of Frankenstein. I mean, it is just a doom-laden, beautifully crafted movie with great. I mean, to me, any movie that has Edward G. Robinson, John Garfield, and Ida Lupino that was made in Warner Brothers in the 1940s, it's going to be great. And the fact that Curtiz directed it, it's a fantastic movie. And kudos to George and the studio for restoring it.
And we also want to thank not only the wizards of ours, as I call them, the people at Warner Brothers Motion Picture Imaging who restored the film and created the new master, but also the people at the Museum of Modern Art Film Archive who actually were protecting this film element that we didn't know about. And I wasn't going to put it out on DVD until we could do it completely. And we thought the only complete version was John Garfield's 16 millimeter print that was on deposit at NYU. So we had brought that print in, thought we'd have to cobble them together, and it was going to look awful. And I said, let's see what Museum of Modern Art has. Let's bring it in. Well, they knew what they had, but they had never told us. And when it arrived here in Burbank, literally at Photochem, where they scanned the nitrate, we were euphoric that we could finally restore the picture and the sound, because that's so important for the Korngold score and the dynamics. And it just goes to speak of the incredible craftsmanship of Curtiz, and that this would be the year before he'd get to make Yankee Doodle Dandy, followed by the film we're celebrating the birthday of tonight, Casablanca. So there's so much to celebrate in this rich cinematic legacy, and I'm very pleased that, I think with the exception of Mountain Justice and some of the silence, we've released, I think, everything he ever made.
Yeah, that's great.
We really have tried to bring it all to the public, and that's the goal of Warner Brothers, is to make all of our history available to generations for the future as well as generations of today. So it's part of the company's commitment to the history of what went on a little bit on Sunset Boulevard, but mostly here in Burbank.
Yeah.
And
Also somewhat on Vitagraph too.
that's true.
Yeah, that's something on Vitagraph
And First
too.
National.
Yeah, and First National. Yeah.
But I think this would be a good time for us to open
Absolutely.
the mic for questions and answers.
You had spoken of Curtiz having been brought in to pump up the action in Robin Hood.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any truth to the story I heard of him doing the same on Captain Blood when the duel wasn't catching fire? And the way I heard it, after several takes where it just seemed limp, he pulls Basil Rathbone aside and says, when you get into that next clinch, lean in and tell Flynn how much more you're making than he is.
That's a very good anecdote, and it could very well be true. However, there's nothing that I found that substantiates that. And in fact, one of the interesting things is the whole relationship between Hal Wallace and Curtiz I found to be absolutely fascinating, because they started out really butting heads. And when I say butting heads, I mean some of the vitriolic tone of these memos that Hubert spoke about at the top and so forth is just, some of the stuff is almost unprintable. And basically it was Curtiz making the movie the way he wanted to make it, and Wallace trying to micromanage every detail from his office, and it didn't work. And they went hammer and tongs over Captain Blood, because everything Curtiz did was different than what Wallace wanted it, and went back and forth. So when they started on Charge of the Light Brigade, he tried to head Curtiz off and really got to a point where he said, I'm going to take you off the picture if you don't start doing things my way with the camera and letting the close-ups run full. And you know, they went up to Calabasas, where the fort was, and you know, Wallace wanted to see close-ups and lines of British soldiers, and when someone talked, a close-up of David Niven, a close-up, and Curtiz was into artistic camera setups, filming Errol Flynn through a water wheel, and uncredited cattle, and people wandering around the fort, you know, because this was in the script, and that's, he wanted to artistically bring that up. So Curtiz had to end up bending his knee to Wallace, and then they ended up becoming the closest of friends, where they rode horses together and so forth, and they really got very close. It's interesting.
In that famous scene where the fellow plays the piano, and I know that the fellow himself couldn't play the piano. And do you have the records of the person who actually was playing the piano behind the scenes for A Kiss Is Just a Kiss?
That is, can everybody hear me okay without a microphone? Yeah. That is a point of controversy, actually. Because we had records that it was one individual that had played the piano, and have recently received correspondence from someone who claims it was someone else. So I can't definitively tell you who exactly it was, because we have conflicting information. And the files, one of the things I learned working on the MGM library is the guy who ran the music department at MGM and kept the legal records would hit the bar about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And Saul Chaplin, who is the associate producer of The Sound of Music and a great composer and a very well-respected gentleman, won an Oscar for his work on American Paris. I got to know him, and he told me, George Snyder was always drunk after 3 o'clock, so you can't trust his paperwork. And I have found this to be true. Now, it very well could be that in the Warner Brothers paperwork that whoever was keeping the records was mixing them up. We know that one person who we have been crediting, which may not be accurate, was a gentleman by the name of Elliot Carpenter.
Yes.
But it's very possible that it may be someone else. So I want to give credit where credit is due to the other person whose name I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and Dooley Wilson was a drummer.
So. I have the pleasure of letting you know that my parents received royalty checks. I played it again in Sam for many years. My dad, William Gage Elfelt, told me that he had been the one who played the piano backstage, or off the screen. And so I'm hoping that IMDb might receive that bit of information.
Never trust IMDb.
Live by IMDb, die by IMDb. Words to live by if you're writing a book.
Thank you for your extensive research to include a guy's circumcision. I just wondered if you could tell us what the other directors at the time, how they viewed Curtiz's work at the time.
There is a interview that I quote in the book with William Dieterle. And Dieterle was an actor at that time, and in fact, there was a German version of Moby Dick made, where Dieterle had the lead, and Curtiz actually directed the movie. And they were making I think the Joan Bennett version during the day, and Curtiz was directing the German version at night, and they did that quite a bit in those days, the two versions of Dracula at Universal, and so forth. But when Dieterle was interviewed in the 60s, he said that if you were at Warner Brothers and you were a director, if you didn't make progress, acceptable progress, even if the script was being rewritten, they would get rid of you and replace you mainly with Mike. And he said Mike had such an instinct for film, he could just do stuff even if he didn't really understand the whole theme of the plot or whatever. He had such an instinct for film. He said he could finish a movie at 11 a.m. and then start a new one at 1 p.m. And he said if I didn't have my script, I was helpless. He said, but Mike could do anything with film. So I think he was respected. Vince Sherman, who I knew, and
I knew him as
George knew him as well. Vince Sherman was in the mix to direct Casablanca, and Hal Wallace told him, I'm going to go with Curtiz, and what Vince said was, it really didn't bother me because I used to visit the set of Mike's films so I could learn how to better direct. So I think he was held in very high esteem. Irving Rapper, who lived a very long life, he referred to Curtiz as his mentor and said he was one of the most sympathetic people I ever met and taught me so much of what I knew about directing, even though I had cauliflower of the Eustachian tubes from all of the broken English and Hungarian, but that Curtiz really knew what he was doing. So I think to answer your question, he was very well respected by many of his peers on the lot.
Well, this leads us perfectly to this idea of shooting without a script or not knowing how the movie's going to end. Epstein brothers did nothing to demystify this whole thing of, there's no way the Casablanca could have ended differently. The story is, as you know, that they were still writing the script when they were shooting. Ilsa didn't know, the actress didn't know whether she was going to leave Bogart or her husband, and that can't be because the production code would never have allowed.
Well, that's exactly right. And first off, and the other thing is Casey Robinson had already months ago gone through the whole script and come up with a scenario where Ingrid Bergman and Victor Laszlo, they were going to go off together. The issue was how were they going to bring it off? Okay, how exactly, what was the dialogue going to be? I mean, you're right, the production code, yeah, let me leave my noble husband to hang out with my saloon keeper, gun-running boyfriend. That wasn't going to happen. And then if they had Paul Henry die, that would have ruined the whole picture. So it was obvious what was going to happen. Now, with all due respect to Ingrid Bergman, she said at length, I didn't know who I was going to go away with, and so on and so forth. And perhaps she actually didn't, but it was certainly obvious to the people making the movie, like Curtiz, Hal Wallace, the screenwriters, they knew what was going to happen. And one interesting slice of this is when they were shooting that final scene, the morning they were doing that, Bogart and Curtiz got in this terrific argument that is documented by the production assistant. And it was so heated that they went and got Hal Wallace and had him come to the set to adjudicate. Now, Wallace had 3 or 4 movies in production at that time. He did not just hang out on the sets of his film. He was a workaholic making all these pictures. But it was so significant, he had to come down, and then the 3 of them kind of huddled off to the side for a period, talked it out, and then that whole last scene where she goes off with Victor and all that was shot.
Was
so
that what the argument was about?
Yeah, that was the argument about. Curtiz wanted to play it one way, Bogart wanted to play it something else. Now, I speculate on different things. One of the things Bogart did one time on a film called Deadline USA that he made is that he came in and he acted confused about the lines and all this other stuff and wouldn't say the lines and argued with Ethel Barrymore, and she said, Humphrey, just say the lines. He goes, it doesn't make sense. He said, why should I do it? He said, because Switzerland has an army, Humphrey. Just do it. And so finally he went to his dressing room and the director came in, Richard Brooks, and he goes, what's going on? And he said, kid, I was out late last night. I needed some time to learn my lines. So whether that happened in the case of Casablanca, I have no clue. But your point that it was obvious structurally what was going to happen, I think is true. But the devil was in the details over how it was going to be played.
So Bergman created that myth. I didn't know who I was going to go.
Well, yeah, I guess so. You can say it's a myth. She might have actually believed it from her perspective, but to say that no one knew how the film was going to end and who she was going to go off with, the documentation just doesn't support that statement.
And Julius Epstein, who said, well, we were still figuring it out. I mean, he sort of plays to that myth.
Well, yeah. I mean, one of the things I wrote in the chapter on Casablanca is that the amount of stuff that has been written about this movie, where all the principles later on, you had, when Hal Wallace went on Oscar night to go up and get his Oscar for his film under his contract, Jack Warner got up and ran up ahead of him and took the Oscar from Jack Benny. And this led to this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and after that happened, there was no doubt that Hal Wallace was going to leave Warner Brothers. But later on, as Casablanca became such a legendary hit, Howard Koch wrote a book that has a lot of things in it that are just flat out wrong. Casey Robinson said he brought up the idea for everyone still wanted to go to Rick's. Everybody wants a share of the credit. And quite frankly, when you talk about who wrote what at what time, it's almost impossible to determine, well, this person wrote 50% and this person wrote 40% and all of this type of stuff. But to me, Casablanca was, Andrew Serifs said it was a happy accident. And I take the position that it was Warner Brothers, the studio system, and everyone coming together in a serendipitous moment, and it was accidentally on purpose because everyone was working at peak pitch, and it all worked.
I would concur with that, and I'll share an anecdote that kind of supports what Alan was saying. In 1992, when I was at MGM, I wanted to do a 40th anniversary edition of Singing in the Rain and wanted to do a documentary about the making of the movie. And I was lucky enough to be friendly with Gene Kelly, and I went to his house and I asked him if he would participate and do that. And he said, please don't do that. I said, now Gene was an amazing guy, but very forthright and very serious about how he wanted things done. And he said to me, please don't do that. I said, why? And he said, because it'll be Rashomon. I'll tell you the story one way. Stanley Donen will tell you the story another way. Betty and Adolph, Condon and Green, will tell you another way. Debbie Reynolds will tell you all sorts of things that weren't true. And he said, it just won't be accurate. And as long as Gene lived, we did not do that. We did do a making of piece after he passed, but I respected his wishes during his lifetime. But the point of the story is that as, no pun intended, as time goes by, these kinds of people remembering anecdotes become quizzical, and that's why the scholarly research that this gentleman has done, going down to the USC archives where all the Warner Brothers files are, preserved and impeccably curated. Alan's research gives you the facts and not the hyperbole. And that's what's so amazing about his book. So,
Thank you, George. That's nice of you to say that.
Of all the Michael Curtiz films that I've seen, I think my least favorite is Santa Fe Trail. I have a problem with the way that movie attacks abolitionists, and it kind of all but defends slavery. What's your opinion of that?
I tend to agree with you. And the reason for that, and I give Santa Fe Trail a little, I don't like it either. I think it was his worst movie he did with Errol Flynn. Part of that was because you had that movie came about when Jack Warner sussed out Robert Buckner, who became a very, very competent writer-producer at Warner Brothers. He had been there a couple of years at that point, and Warner said something like, what was going on in Kansas? Can't we make a movie about the railroad going through Kansas? And so Buckner said, well, what was really going on was Bleeding Kansas, John Brown, and the whole slavery thing. And Warner's response was, yeah, John Brown, good, we'll make the son of a bitch the heavy. And that was how the movie started. So there was this straddling that in retrospect now, sitting here in 2017, appears very distasteful about slavery, and this ambivalence on the part of Flynn's character about, well, you know, slavery is really bad, but let's let the South sort it out so they won't be embarrassed by it, and this type of thing. And this type of equivocating on social issues was something that Hal Wallace did very, very well. He did it with Black Fury about Paul Muni and the coal miners, where, you know, the companies that hired the goons aren't bad and the miners aren't bad, but let's make the bad guys these gangsters that are trying to do the mines. We'll create this straw man to do that. You also have to remember the attitude and the times of 1940, the fact that Warner Brothers had a lot of theaters that are south of the Mason-Dixon line and so forth, and Buckner was a Virginian. So there was a lot of this period equivocating on that. And the other thing about that movie, real quickly, is that they have Custer, Longstreet, all these Civil War generals that went through West Point in different times, as much as 10 years apart, and the script has them all graduating together and going out to the frontier like the Rover Boys, as supposedly Crowther put it. It's completely, the script's historically ludicrous even by Hollywood standards.
Just a question, because it was Casablanca shot in nitrate, and you know, you talked about preservation. Do you see a difference between nitrate and the safety film?
Let George answer. You take that.
Because I saw an incredible print of King Kong at the Academy a couple of years ago, and it blew me away. I'd never seen a nitrate print before, and it was incredible. It's like we went backwards.
well, I think that nitrate film is extremely flammable, and the industry switched to safety film in the early 1950s. Nitrate is very subject to decomposition, and so many of our films, I think it's 90% of all silent films and 50% of all films made before 1950 no longer exist because the nitrate has decomposed. So the move to safety film was really the right one for the industry. However, when you see a film that was shot on nitrate and you see a nitrate print, you see a glow to the silver and blacks that are black that you've never seen before. I remember when I was a child, Radio City Music Hall, I grew up in New York, Radio City Music Hall had stopped having continuous movie theater showings because they were having hard times. And they had an Art Deco exhibition in which they were showing nitrate prints of films like Swing Time and Captain Blood, Poor Little Rich Girl, Alexander's Ragtime Band. I got to see all these films in nitrate, and you really can't describe it. It
No, it
is.
you're
different.
It is. Now, this is assuming that the nitrate print, as George put it, is in good condition.
Right.
I have seen a nitrate print of Casablanca last 2016, the years are running together on me, when the Egyptian Theater recently got the capability to project nitrate. And moving nitrate is like moving a bomb. It's all, and that's why the projection booths were like pillboxes and so on. It's very dicey. But they showed a print of Casablanca nitrate, and it was terrific, but it wasn't the greatest print. But when you see a well-preserved nitrate print, there is that glow. I remember seeing one at the Academy in Nightmare Alley, and Tyrone Power's face. I mean, it's like, I went, my God, look at that. And where the sidewalk ends was another picture. Just gorgeous. But it's, as George said, it was the right move to get away from it.
And the thing is that, like, one of the things about photochemical process and making a print is not every print will be made perfectly. And we may have an archival Technicolor print that we would use as a reference that could be a lab reject. And unless we have paperwork documenting that, how are we to know that that wasn't a 0.2 yellow and it was discarded? So you are really at the mercy of the lab timer. Everything is far more buttoned down today technologically. But what we have lost is a sheen to nitrate that you really can't recapture any other way. I will say that when we are working from nitrate originals and scanning them at 4K, the colorists who create our video masters, especially for Blu-ray, really try to capture as best as possible that look of nitrate. And this restoration of the Seawolf, what was restored about it was we had all the footage as it was originally released. We came from a nitrate fine grain. And what that means, it was a nitrate print on fine grain stock, not a release print. The fine grain would be used to make a dupe negative, which would make a print. So this was exquisite to look at. So when it is captured in a 4K scan at 16 bits, you get more of the image than you would have gotten if this had been done 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So our technology is capturing as close as possible when we're working from nitrate sources that look, but nothing will ever replace. It's just like a great dye transfer Technicolor print. Nothing can ever quite make it 100%. 99 is about the best we can do.
Well said.
Thank you. I'm 86, and I saw Casablanca when it first came out. And it's one of my granddaughter's favorite pictures. And I have to explain to them what it was like then. Because we were at war on two fronts. Hitler owned Europe and was probably going to own Great Britain. And at the time, we didn't know that we were going to win that war.
Very well said. One of the points I made in the book is when Casablanca was released, I think the U.S. had already had 20,000 combat casualties in North Africa. Now, so think about that, 20,000 Americans. I mean, we rightfully get upset over the death of one human being, and we should never change how we feel. But when you look at the order of magnitude of what World War II was like, and one of the other things I wrote in the book is when Paul Henry, as Victor Laszlo, says at the end, "Welcome back to the fight. I know our side is going to win." That wasn't just some toss-off line of propaganda. That was a shared affirmation of the country coming together. And I really think for then, Casablanca was really a commitment of we knew that we were on the right side. And when you watch Casablanca, there was absolutely no doubt about it. There wasn't a doubt about it in 43, and to me, there's not a doubt about it now.
And it represents the fact that the country was unified in looking to be on the right side of things.
Absolutely.
As opposed to wrong. And Casablanca crystallized that moment in time, and people should never forget. And that's why the film is so powerful and retains its magnetism today. It's
Absolutely.
wonderful. Thank you for sharing.
And thank you, Ed. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.
My dad was in Prague when the Nazi troops marched in, and he had to escape. He was on a list that wasn't good, and he made his way to Scotland and then the United States. And when he got to America in late '38, he said it was very difficult to impress upon people what the stakes were in Europe and how the United States couldn't just sit back and ignore it. And he said when Casablanca came out, he was so happy because it was like a tutorial. It gave a message to the American people that was beyond just entertainment and drama. He said it was the most important film ever made. Wow.
Thank you for staying. And I wanted to thank Alan Brody for coming this evening. And let's have a round of applause for George Feltenstein.